2034 was a year of both fear and hope for Atlantis. This newly formed civilizational state worked tirelessly on constructing a massive security apparatus, though not one aimed at any geopolitical threat. The first ever space elevator was constructed, allowing for massive flexibility and reductions in space travel costs. After the construction of the elevator, dozens of satellites with powerful lasers were deployed in orbit, getting ready to move or destroy the two asteroids headed to Earth. In case these failed, a dozen underground cities in North America and Europe were under construction to allow the European people and civilization to continue in case these defenses failed. Trillions were poured into this emerging space infrastructure, the underground cities, and R&D spending. The Oceania Commonwealth was also founded in 2034, bringing Australia and New Zealand into the European Federation, allowing these resources to be used for these new projects. To maintain public optimism, aesthetic zones were created, and European aesthetic events were held, inspiring the population with aesthetic sporting, music, and modeling events, and infrastructure. The biggest EDM concert in world history was held in Berlin, hosting 10 million Europeans for a 2-week period. By 2035, the defense network in space had been sufficiently established, was activated, and was 100% successful in the complete destruction of these two asteroids headed to Earth. Within minutes, hundreds of millions of Europeans were raised to their feet, yelling in joy at what they had achieved. Atlantis was saved, and in the process, the planet was saved as well. However, non-Europeans around the world looked to this with both joy at not being affected by an asteroid, but also fear and jealousy of the European people and what the Europeans could do now that they were united and have a collective and future-oriented identity. Plans were formed to weaken European power and to divide Europeans. Though the European Federation was in the process of moving all advanced chip production to be internal, it still relied heavily on Taiwan for its advanced chips and would for the next few years. Also, the rare earth production capacity and reserves of the European Federation were not sufficient yet to support their continued civilizational growth independent of outside imports. To solve these crises and to bring Russian Slavs into the fold of the European family, major investments and connections were being made to bring Russia into the European Commonwealth. The decision would be finalized in the Russian elections of 2035. China, India, Iran, Turkey, and several other major non-European powers decided to coordinate a resource embargo, cyber attacks, invasion of Taiwan, Mexican cartel invasion of the United States, and intervention in Russia's elections to divide, distract, and ultimately weaken the European people. The day of the Russian elections, a massive cyber attack crippled much of the intelligence apparatus of the European Federation while manipulating the results of the Russian election. A candidate secretly backed by China won and immediately asked for Chinese and Indian military forces to enter the nation to secure his election. Within 48 hours, a few 100,000 pre-positioned Chinese, Iranian, Turkish, and Indian troops had entered Russia via train, air, and sea, securing the major cities, resources, and borders with the European Federation, all without firing a shot. Hundreds of thousands of more troops, thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, and thousands of artillery pieces would enter the following week. However, a massive insurgency erupted throughout Russia after the first week of occupation, aided by Russian military veterans and many active-duty Russian military personnel who were disgusted with the situation. The European Federation issued an ultimatum for all foreign forces to withdraw from Russia, or an invasion would result. China, in return, launched further cyber attacks and began invading Taiwan. All the while, the resource embargo was fully implemented and chaos at the North American Commonwealth's southern border was unleashed. Rather than demoralizing and dividing the European people along nationalistic lines, these actions further unified Europeans across the world. The naval, air, and space forces based out of the North American Commonwealth stabilized the situation in Taiwan with massive naval battles, unseen since World War II. A few thousand Chinese and Indian naval ships, thousands of aircraft, thousands of drones, and thousands of missiles fought to seize Taiwan, blockade Japan and Korea, and defeat all European Federation forces sent against it. The European Federation sent a dozen carrier battle groups, supported by thousands of its own aircraft, drones, and missiles, fought back with support from an orbital space-based weapon system called Rods from God, unleashing devastation on whole naval formations, land-based anti-ship weapons platforms, and Chinese troop formations on Taiwan. In the first naval engagement, off Okinawa, China unleashed a few thousand anti-ship missiles, 700 aircraft, and 50 ships against two Federation carrier battle groups. A Federation carrier was destroyed by a dozen Chinese missiles, slamming into it at the same time, and several Aegis cruisers and destroyers were lost, despite 98% of the anti-ship missiles being destroyed by the Aegis defenses. In retaliation, 24 C-130s equipped with Rapid Dragon platforms destroyed all 50 ships and 9 Chinese naval facilities and hundreds of Chinese stealth aircraft parked in their hangars, crippling Chinese resupply and logistic operations to Taiwan, and to sustain its blockades and destroying most of their stealth aircraft inventory. A week after the first naval engagement, 5 Federation carrier battle groups fought off a combined Chinese and Indian armada of 2,000 ships off the Philippines. The first day of fighting saw 500 fifth-generation aircraft working with dozens of electronic warfare aircraft and 500 fourth-generation aircraft to engage with and swat down hordes of enemy aircraft and drones to open up the path for bombers, cruise missiles, and Rapid Dragon platforms to reach the armada. After air superiority had been won, thousands of anti-ship missiles and torpedoes were unleashed on the biggest fleet seen in modern history. After 2 days of intense fighting, the Federation had destroyed every ship in the armada and 5,000 aircraft, while the Federation lost 1 supercarrier, 3 Aegis destroyers, and 200 aircraft. This battle saw the destruction of every Chinese and Indian carrier, cruiser, and the rest of their stealth aircraft, along with the total depletion of Chinese anti-ship missile stocks, swinging the East Asian campaign favorably in the Federation's favor. After this battle, the remaining carrier battle groups that were at relatively full strength for ships, ammunition, aircraft, and missiles would assist with retaking the rest of Taiwan, blockading trade for China and India, and destroying every airbase, naval base, logistics and supply hub, and factories that made weapons platforms. The carrier battle groups that sustained heavy damage and/or had heavily depleted their ammunition, missiles, and supplies were sent to the North American Commonwealth's west coast for rearming and repairs in case they were needed again in the near future. European Federation amphibious forces secured the Panama Canal and resource deposits in Latin America, while these naval engagements in the West Pacific were being carried out. On the border, grassroots groups of European Americans fought back against the drug cartels. In one such engagement, the self-designated 3rd Patriot Legion, a group of 500 men defeated 20,000 cartel members and thousands of Mexican troops in a week-long border clash on the Rio Grande. Though 4 of these brave European Americans lost their lives, they killed over 15,000 Aztec soldiers and defended San Antonio from the promised city razing the drug cartels promised if they broke through the border. Given European Federation land forces were stretched thin at the time, the 3rd Patriot Legion stand saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of European Americans in San Antonio and Texas at large from the cartel barbarism. European Commonwealth forces prepared forces along the border with Russia, while special operations groups, drones, and stealth aircraft secured Russian nuclear and biological weapons sites, or destroyed them if this failed. Seeing the invasion of Russia from a united Europe to liberate Russia from Asiatic forces and a Eurasian regime, tens of thousands of older tanks from the Cold War days were dusted off, and millions upon millions of Arabs, Turks, and Indians were given minimal training, armed with AK-47s, RPGs, small drones, and other weapons, and sent to the Russian border with the European Federation, all to act as cannon fodder to stop the European advance. In the early summer of 2036, after the heavy rains were over, the invasion to liberate Russia and to bring the Russian Slavs fully into the European family began. The forces dwarfed those of any invasion before. 6 million European troops, supported by 20,000 modern tanks, thousands of advanced aircraft, hordes of drones, and tens of thousands of cruise missiles and significant naval forces, crossed the border to face off against 30 million troops and 200,000 tanks, though most of these troops were Arabic, Turkish, or Indian cannon fodder, and the tanks and aircraft often dated to the Cold War or even World War II era. The operation began on June 22, 2036. The results were stunning. In the first day of conflict, thousands of cruise missiles, drones, fighters, dozens of bombers, and several dozen rod-from-God strikes had destroyed 20,000 enemy aircraft, most of which were destroyed on the ground, allowing the European Federation to seize air superiority for the rest of the campaign. Precision artillery, A-10s, AC-130 gunships, and hundreds of cruise missiles opened wide gaps in the front, allowing for mass formations of European Federation vehicles to pour across the flat Russian plains, advancing rapidly and achieving key objectives. Within 3 months, European Federation forces had managed to seize all major European Russian cities and captured millions of troops, all with minimal losses of life to Federation forces. In one such battle, a German-born field marshal, known post-war as Panzer Daddy, used 3 tank armies and 3 mechanized infantry corps to envelop and encircle 5 million men and 40,000 tanks centered around the town of Prokhorovka. After 3 days of intense fighting and minimal losses to European Federation forces, millions of foreign men laid down their arms and surrendered in the face of the massively successful push, combined arms tactics, and European drive and spirit. The combined use of tanks, infantry armed fighting vehicles, missile artillery, drones, A-10s, AC-130 gunships, cruise missiles, and rods from God resulted in the complete destruction of whole enemy divisions and corps within hours. The Leopolds, Bradleys, and A-10s had been upgraded with point defense laser systems, allowing them to destroy incoming shells and smaller missiles with relative ease, protecting the lives of the European crew. After unleashing the orbital weapon platform, known as Rods from God, on massive troop concentrations, bases, and supply deposits, forces simply surrendered. In most of the battles, European forces easily won, even when outnumbered by factors of 5-1 or 10-1. The superior European resolve, technology, and spirit ensured massive victories and advances. While Moscow and other major cities were secured by European Federation ground and air forces, the naval forces of the European Federation managed to destroy the Chinese and Indian blockades of Korea and Japan, had destroyed all Chinese forces on Taiwan, laid waste to all Chinese military bases, ports, and logistics hubs on its coast, and destroyed every major Chinese and Indian surface vessel. Though the European Federation over the course of the campaign did lose 2 supercarriers, 24 major surface vessels, 800 aircraft, and 30,000 had lost their lives. This was a fraction of the Chinese and Indian lost in this theater, which numbered at around 2 million personnel, 15,000 aircraft, thousands of drones, and every major surface vessel. Seeing the writing on the wall and trying to scare the Europeans, China unleashed 50% of its nuclear weapons on European cities. Unknown to all, except those intimate with the project, the satellites that were designed to destroy asteroids could easily shoot and destroy intercontinental ballistic missiles. 99% of the nuclear-tipped missiles were shot down by these satellites within minutes of launch, and the remaining defense technologies shot down the rest in their mid-course phases. With its nuclear deterrence made out to be a paper tiger, Navy and Air Force decimated, and armies of its allies broken easily from European advances in Russia, the Chinese regime and its allies sued for peace. The European Federation took advantage of this, getting hundreds of billions of reparations, forcing the nuclear disarmament on all non-European militaries, the destruction of all non-European Federation blue water Navy ships, and forcing all of these governments to agree to leave the moon alone, giving Europeans a monopoly on settlement and development of the moon. Though the European Federation wanted to exact total revenge on the other nations that participated, the European people during the war had managed to use its power projection capabilities to secure resources and strategically important areas in North Africa and Latin America, to ensure its appetite for more resources could be fulfilled. Now was a time for replanning, rebuilding, and focusing on internal, orbital, and lunar infrastructure, not exacting total revenge. Russia, too, needed to be brought fully up to European Commonwealth standards of living, with its infrastructure brought up to modern standards, allowing access to Russian land for mass European settlement and Russian resources for internal development and infrastructure. In the post-war technological progress and civilizational spirit, combined with Gerald Lee's infrastructure and economic policies, lead to unprecedented per-person growths in standard of living. Median per capita income increased on average 11% a year between 2033 and 2040, all while reducing CO2 emissions by 80%, increasing civilizational industrial output by a factor of 3, and building up the investment and emergency funds. With this newfound dominance of the globe and rapidly expanding standards of living, the Federation looked to secure its foothold on the Moon, turning it into a center of mining, industry, and science, while looking to expand its foothold further on Earth via the creation of another Commonwealth and retaking historic lands. In Episode 2, learn how the European Federation manages to spread its foothold in the solar system, Latin America, and retakes Constantinople.